Hello, everybody. Before you start the podcast, I wanted to tell you guys about a current special limited time offer that we are running with our intelligence school. We're offering our intelligence cycle fundamentals course for $500 off, normal $1,500, now $997, until midnight on the 11th to 12th of November. So that's next Tuesday, I believe. It's the lowest price we ever offered it. It's a real world intelligence training accredited from Salford University. And I don't think you'll regret it. We've got tons of reviews and people have been really positive about it. So grab it. It will be in the link in the description of this episode. And I will see you guys in the episode. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Great Dynamics podcast. My name is Ahmed Hassan. And today with me, as always, very special guest, Lewis Sage-Passant. And Louis is a Adjunct Professor at Sciences Po in Paris. He wrote a very interesting book on private intelligence. We'll get into a little bit more. And at the moment, he's also global head of intelligence for a large corporation in Europe. Louis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, how did you get here, Louis? I mean, you have a very interesting CV. And yeah, I would love to hear, how did you get to this point in your career?
A lot of good luck, to be honest with you. So I never set out to get into the intelligence field. I went to university with plans originally to become a Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm pilot. And while I was at university, I ended up joining the Army Reserve as an infantry soldier, and then fell in love with infanteering, became an Army officer. And then when I was in the Army, they sent me for intelligence training. And that's kind of where I discovered the field and fell in love with it. And after a tour of duty in Afghanistan, I came back to Europe and ended up looking for a job outside of the military. And I came across an energy company in the Middle East that was looking for an intelligence analyst. So I moved out there and spent a few years looking at kind of all sorts of threats for them, ranging from terrorism, armed conflict, kidnappings, and so on. A really, really interesting job for a really interesting company that was working in some quite high-risk places. So a really great place to learn a lot about intelligence in the private sector. And after leaving that company, I moved out to Hong Kong, where I spent a couple of years working for one of the big investment banks, running their crisis management and intelligence team for Asia. And that was quite a high-stress, high-paced job. And again, learned a lot about a new region, especially, which was very cool. And I ended up leaving that role, moving to France, where I spent a couple of years running a small travel security startup, which was a ton of fun. Did not make much money, but really enjoyed doing it and learned a lot. And after a couple of years there, I got approached by a US tech firm that was looking for someone to help them with physical security and then eventually some intelligence work. And in my time there, I started working on a PhD. That was kind of my COVID lockdown project. Started working on a PhD looking at private sector intelligence. And while I was doing that PhD, the chief security officer approached me and kind of said, look, we need to elevate our game when it comes to a certain type of intelligence, which was kind of geopolitical risk intelligence. Would you like to, work for a team doing that? So I jumped at the chance, did that. And then after about 5 years with that company, I ended up getting approached by someone who said, hey, there's this big European company that's in the pharma space that's looking for a global head of intelligence. And that's where I am now. And my role here, I do two things. I look at geopolitical risks and I look at kind of the counter-espionage space. And it's a really fantastic role in a very cool company. So really enjoying it. So I think a lot of good luck. I think like most people in this field, I didn't sort of set out to get into the industry. I ended up just sort of stumbling in it. And very glad I did, because it's such a cool place to work and it's such a fascinating environment.
Absolutely. That's very interesting. I didn't know some of the paths in the career that you have taken, so that's very cool to learn. I mean, if you had to give a difference between on the government side and being on a private side, what would you say is the biggest difference?
I would say there's a few. It's hard to say which is the biggest because there's quite a few. So I'd say, first of all, in terms of similarities, it looks very familiar. If you take anyone from any government intelligence agency or organization, drop them into private sector intelligence, they'll understand it. They'll find their way around fairly easily. But I would say the differences are still fairly surprising. I think one is how cooperative it is. Government intelligence, there is cooperation, but it's very strictly regulated. It's very much the exception to share things rather than the norm. In private sector intelligence, it's the opposite. Sharing is the norm across companies. Even commercial rivals will share finished intelligence products with each other. There's a lot of peer-to-peer cooperation because we see intelligence and security as a non-competitive endeavor. We're facing common threats. It's also because, we don't have the expertise in everything. Unlike government intelligence where, you're very focused on a very niche topic, in the private sector, often there's one or two of you covering the whole world in a team. Now, my job, I'm not an expert on every country. So if I have a question about, let's say, I don't know, Algeria, someone says, tell me about Algeria, we're going to do a project there. I can reach out to the intelligence network and say, hey, does anyone here know much about Algeria? Is there anyone whose brains I can pick on this? And you'll find people coming forward and say, yep, that's a real area of focus in my work. Let's have a chat. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One is, like I say, they're common threats. I think the other side of it is these industry networks are also a really great way to find jobs and find careers across the industry. So it's in people's interest to be seen as a cooperative, friendly member of the field. Because when you go looking for a job, people go, oh yeah, I know this guy. He's shared a lot of intelligence with us in the past. He's really great to work with. I've seen some of his work. We should interview him. So it's in people's own interest to be cooperative. And that's something that I think often surprises people in the government world. I think finally, one of the big changes, there's a big differences is how creative the private sector is. We have no real security controls around what we do in the way government folks do, which means if you wake up tomorrow and have an idea of how to get intelligence using a new tool, a new technique, as long as it's legal and ethical, there's nothing to stop you from trying. And I've seen that in action in my research. I came across some examples of where governments had gotten a certain piece of analysis wrong in quite a high profile way, whereas the private sector had figured out exactly what was going on, at least in some cases. And in many cases, it was because that creativity let them play with new tools and toys. So, it's a very different field, but like I say, familiar enough that someone coming out of government would understand it.
Yeah. I find it fascinating, especially the last point that you make there. I think that makes it a lot of fun. At least it does for me. But do you remember when there was a special report on Libya that came out a couple of years ago that was lambasted by the OSINT community because it had so many things wrong? I think that was for me the first aha moment that, hey, wait a second, there's some really brilliant people in the OSINT community, and they're doing some actual powerful work. And in many cases also not being appreciated or respected. I tell a lot of young people that I know in space that just know that your work is being used in government circles, but they cannot credit you. All right? Just know that your work is respected. And you have to just be in the space that you won't get credit. But so won't the people on the inside won't get credit either. That's kind of part of the job, right? But that I found very interesting. I would like to, because I hadn't prepared this, but since you mentioned it, I want to talk about it. Your startup, you had a little travel security startup. Can you tell more about that? I'm very curious.
Yeah, so to what you just said there, I'd say I fully agree. I think this field is one where I often tell my students, if you want applause, join the circus, as the old saying goes. And this field is not one for glory, but it's really important work at the same time. And that Libya report was particularly interesting because it wasn't the first time even Libya came up in that private-public intelligence dynamic. When I wanted to do my PhD, one of the first questions that I was trying to answer was, who's doing intelligence better in certain circumstances? And one of the kind of motivations for that was the Arab Spring, and where the US government in particular had been saying up until a couple of days before the collapse of some of the regional regimes that this would all blow over really quickly, whereas the oil and gas companies operating across Nigeria and places like Libya had very quickly recognized this was something far bigger than anyone had seen before, and that it probably wasn't going away. And as a result, they evacuated the people quite early. And to come back to this point about creativity, when the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the US pulled these companies in to sort of say, hey, we have a multi-billion-dollar intelligence budget. How did you beat us at this? Their answer was, well, we've got this newfangled thing called social media that we've started using, and we've realized that we can just see so much by using this tool. And, this was something the government hadn't quite picked up on yet. It takes some time to integrate new technologies, whereas the private sector can just do it and see what happens. And they ended up being very successful as a result of that. To your question about the startup, so it was called How Safe Is My Trip? And the idea was it was designed to essentially provide a travel security department for companies and organizations that were too small to have their own and that couldn't afford some of the big contractors in this space. And initially I had this idea that, it would be for very small companies and maybe kind of private travelers who were particularly worried that needed a bit of help with security management, high net worth travelers and so on. What I actually found was most of the business was coming from private schools, universities, and other organizations that were sending students abroad on field trips because they found that the insurance companies they were using were insisting that they were having professional risk assessments done on their travel. And it was a really interesting line of work. The reason I ended up stopping it was, one, there's a bit of money in it, but it's hard work. And when I looked at the hours worked, the money I was making, I think I could have done better just going to work in a fast food restaurant. I think I would have had far more stable income and probably far less stress. Oh, yeah. But also what I found was that I love doing analysis. That's what I really enjoy doing. And with that job, I was spending most of my time doing marketing, sales, all the stuff I'm not good at, and outsourcing the analysis work to analysts who, were also really good at it, but that's kind of what I wanted to do. So when I got the offer to come in-house and do this kind of stuff, I really did leap at it. I don't regret doing it for a second because I think you learn so much by being an entrepreneur. And I think it's such an interesting field to be doing it in as well. So I definitely don't regret it, but it's not something I would say I miss too much. I'm really happy where I ended up.
I hear you. I think in the first couple of years when I started Great Dynamics, I struggled massively, doing contracting work on the side and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, luckily, we found our niche. But I've also always liked this side of the industry where you can be maybe a bit more of a media company and you can share reports that are open, that that people can engage with and ask questions and have conversations about. And we've had this internship program that we've been running for 7 years, basically since we started the company. And it was based on a comment of one of my old professors. I think you know him, Christian Gustafsson. And he said, man, you should do an internship. And we started doing that, and it kind of like got out of hand. And 100 people later,
wow,
I think that's all the reason also why we developed the school, the online school and everything, because we saw what people needed. And then they all kept asking me that when they were looking for other jobs and the next step, like, how do I do this? Where do I find it? That I started this podcast because I wanted to show people that intelligence is kind of everywhere, even though they don't call it intelligence. And I mean, I think a perfect segue is your book, because there's companies in there that, you wouldn't associate with intelligence gathering. And I mean, maybe, people in the industry would, but I think as an outsider, you wouldn't. But your book, Beyond States and Spies, the Security Intelligence Services of the Private Sector, I wish I had written that book, but I'm happy you did. Loved the book. I've have only the digital copy. And as I said to you earlier, I've ordered a hard copy. But how did that book came about?
Yeah, it's I'm really glad to hear you say you wish you'd written it, because I think the one thing I really want this book to be is a launch pad for more debate about this field. The one thing I kept saying throughout the book, and that I kept being very aware of while writing it, is the intelligence field is enormous, and it looks so completely different depending on what part of the industry you're in. And exactly as like you say, there are some companies where people go, "Oh my God, they have an intelligence team. That's crazy." But to the people in that part of the industry, they'll say, "No, that's completely normal." But wait, hang on, you're saying that this other industry does intelligence too? Wow, I didn't know that. It's so disjointed in that sense. And I think as a result, there's a lot of room for academic maturity in this space to look at this and say, okay, what I wanted to do with this book was to essentially settle the argument that private sector intelligence really exists. Because in certain corners of the academic world, and I think this is going away a lot now, there's a lot of resistance to the idea that anything outside of governments and secret stuff can be intelligence. Often intelligence can be defined as when the government goes out and does spying stuff. And so I wrote this book to really try and progress that argument and say, actually, no, it can exist outside of government. Now, I think post-invasion of Ukraine, a lot of things we've seen in the OSINT world that have now reached kind of mainstream awareness, things that have been going on, as you know, for years and years. But I think since 2022, more people are aware of now. I think that's helped move the debate forward. I think the work of organizations like Bellingcat and so on, I think have also helped kind of garner public awareness. Podcasts like yours and the publications you guys put out, I think all of that helps build awareness that this is going on. But when I started, I went to speak to my university and said, look, I want to do this PhD. It's COVID. I've got plenty of time on my hands. My company at the time was offering a really generous PhD scholarship. So I said, I want to do something on private intelligence. And I'd like to look at who's doing it better, government or the private sector. And they turned around and said, what on earth do you mean private sector intelligence? Do you mean government contracting? And they were assuming I was talking about the kind of Booz Allen Hamilton, SAIC, those kind of companies. And I tried to explain, no, what I'm trying to talk about here is when companies are doing intelligence for themselves, not for government consumption. And they just looked at me in this completely baffled way and said, does that happen? What do you mean? And it took a lot of effort to really get some people to understand that this actually is a thing that happens. So I wanted the book to be this kind of, yes, it exists. Here's a baseline of what it looks like from one corner of the industry. But exactly as we've been saying, it's a very broad industry with a lot of variation. So I'm really hoping it's also a launch pad for a kind of subfield of intelligence studies looking at the private sector, because there's so much to explore there. It's something that I always encourage students who are thinking about doing a PhD or an MA or anything where they're writing a thesis about this field to really dive in headfirst, because the private sector space has so much room for academic study. There's so many subjects left to do. It's one that I think has a lot of room to grow, and it's a really exciting time to be looking at this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you mentioned on the lack of understanding in certain sectors, I mean, it has helped me now better explain at birthday parties what I do. And so I think there's a wider acceptance of it. I will say this, since I started, I've encountered companies that have zero profile, and they seem to be doing enormous jobs. And I think that space of them doing it by themselves or doing it alone is kind of disappearing. And there's so much more like disruption with technology and other players coming up. And something that I always try to explain to people, the differences between how private intelligence works, because in one way, even though I'm in it, I'm critical about it. But I wanted to ask you, could you explain what the difference is between an in-house corporate intelligence team and private intelligence vendors and service providers, and how they interact?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to the point about birthday parties, here in France, it's an even more hidden away industry. I find it so difficult to explain to people what I do for a living. I often start by saying, look, I do a job that doesn't really exist here. There's not really a good definition for it. The French equivalent of the industry looks radically different to what you find elsewhere. It's much more, they call it renseignement économique, like economic intelligence. Is much more tied in with business intelligence, competitive intelligence, and security and geopolitical intelligence all bundled into one. So I definitely feel your pain there. In terms of the kind of differences, so when I talk about in-house teams, I'm talking about within a major corporation, so a household name corporation. So just completely pulling some out of the air here, think about Starbucks, Disney, Microsoft, all these kinds of companies. They will often have security intelligence teams whose job is safeguarding the company, their people, fulfilling duty of care for travel security and things like that, looking at the threats to the company. You have physical versions of that, you have cybersecurity versions of that. And then in some cases also looking after the customers, making sure that the customers, when they're visiting their properties, if it's Disney, a theme park, for example, that they're kept safe. So it's a huge, huge landscape there. And then I use the term vendors to refer to the enormous constellation of companies that provide them with intelligence. Because what tends to happen is an in-house team is usually quite small. companies don't have the economics that support them hiring hundreds of analysts. And, if you think about the CIA or the UK intelligence services, where they have desk expertise, that you sit on the North Africa desk and all you do is look at North Africa and you're an expert in that country and maybe even just a tiny slice of that country. The economics in the private sector don't really support that. What you might have is between 2 and 10 people to cover the whole world. And, 10 is very generous. Many big companies only have 1 or 2 people. But you still need that expertise. If the company says tomorrow, we're going to go build a factory in Algeria, you need to be able to find out about that country. So what you'll do is, like I said earlier, first you'll reach out to your network and say, can anyone help me on this to get a broader understanding? But then as you start looking seriously at making that investment, you'll start turning to these intelligence vendors and saying, okay, I need a report on Algeria. I need your experts in Algeria to come speak to us. And you'll have companies that they do have the economics to employ hundreds of analysts with expertise in very niche areas of the world, because that's what they sell. That's their core business. So you go to them and they'll put you in touch with their Algeria analysts who have spent years working on it. They probably speak the language. Maybe they're from that country. They're able to give you some really in-depth knowledge. And then from that, you're able to gather that picture that wouldn't be economical to have in-house. So it's a really interesting dynamic between these two parts of the business. But it already, just in that space, you can see how much variation there is in the types of jobs available and the types of ways the industry works.
Yeah. And because in my experience, and I think you will agree with me on it, even a lot of companies that say they do intelligence, they don't really do intelligence. And I'm not being pedantic on the word intelligence or the difference between intelligence and information. I'm talking about there's these companies that basically what they do is embed analysts, right? And can you talk a little bit more about that and the differences between vendors that actually collect intelligence and develop it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I'd say the word intelligence is used very loosely. In some cases, like I say, in the academic space, it can have a very narrow meaning. It's when governments do secret things. And then when you come out to the private sector, it often gets too loose, and you have anything to do with data, information, can use the term intelligence. I've come across roles that are completely unrecognizable to me as intelligence roles that have that title, because I often think it sounds good as a marketing term. It sounds like intelligence, it sounds like information, but sexier. So people use it to kind of spice things up a little bit. In reality, to me, I see intelligence as being something that has to have that basis in security. And, I think as a result of that, I'm looking at a much narrower area of the field. In terms of the types of vendors, there is so much variation between them. So like you say, there are some that act as essentially staffing agencies, but what they're very good at doing is finding people who have a specific profile in doing intelligence. So they're not generating the intelligence themselves, but if you go to them and say, I need an analyst who's an expert in counter-espionage, or I need an analyst who's an expert in, Middle East conflict dynamics, they will find that person for you. And then they will place them for you as either recruit them for you in-house, or they will embed them for you as a kind of contractor. You've also got the intelligence firms that they are producing intelligence. That is their product they sell. So the analysts work for them, and they have multiple different clients in different sectors, and they send you their finished reports, and you can task them. They also have their kind of regular push intelligence reports, daily briefings and so on. And that's the product they're selling rather than the analysts themselves. And then there's a million other different ways of doing it. It's such a varied field. And I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that there's very little standardization. There are very few, there's no universally recognized qualification. If you wanted to work in the law space or the medical field, you have to have a certain type of qualification from a regulated sector. You can't just call yourself a doctor or a lawyer. In the intelligence field, you can. And as a result, there's a lot of variation in both quality from some extremely highly capable companies that can do some very impressive stuff, down to companies that are making claims they can do things, but sometimes it's maybe not as good as people think. So it's a very, very varied space.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that too. And I think on the lack of standardization, I don't know if it's possible, because a lot of people are benefiting from the lack of standardization. You mentioned earlier oil and gas industry. It's actually how my company got started in the private intelligence sector. But could you tell us a little bit more about what part the oil and gas industry played in developing private intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something I look at in the book. I have a chapter on the history of the field, going back quite literally centuries. It's something I always encourage people to understand is a lot of the academic debate has been focused on how private sector intelligence is this new thing that is appeared in the last few years, and it's kind of overtaken or supplanted a monopoly of government intelligence. In reality, I actually found that private sector organizations in some cases have been doing intelligence longer than any organized nation state intelligence agency. It's literally been around for centuries, but it was never standard. It was just this odd thing that certain companies did because their risk levels were so high or they were exposed in a really specific way, until the oil and gas companies really started to get big in the kind of 60s and 70s. And I work with another scholar, Dr. Maria Robson-Morrow at Harvard University, and she introduced this idea to me, which was that, about the sort of 60s and 70s period, the Middle East was getting a lot more shaky. The oil and gas companies still had to operate there because that's where the hydrocarbons were. And they needed a way to navigate this part of the world. So they started standardizing the idea of having an intelligence team, that it went from being this niche thing some companies did to being something an entire industrial sector did. So I think they've played an incredibly important role. And I think it's from oil and gas we saw this develop into a more standard thing as it is today, where pretty much every major company has a security intelligence team. I think that's really where it all started.
Yeah. I'm often surprised with how well informed oil and gas companies already are, and what they want to know is that extremely niche information. And also, when you mentioned another industry, I think that has developed or has grown private intelligence, the pharmaceutical industry, because they have such a big footprint around the world. Can you tell us a little bit more? I know that's your industry that you work in, but how a pharmaceutical industry might use intelligence, and how would that be beneficial for them to have?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a few ways. So firstly, if you think about the purely defensive side, if you think about the defensive side, a pharma company, as you say, has a huge footprint around the world. They have a lot of travel going on. So first for them is duty of care to their employees, making sure that the staff they're sending around the world are kept safe, that their staff based in various countries around the world are protected. So to do that, you need intelligence to understand the risk profile. If we're sending you, let's say you're our employee and we're sending you to Latin America, to I don't know, Mexico on a business trip, we need to understand, are you going to be kidnapped? Is there a risk of you being threatened, robbed, coming into some sort of danger because of this? Because we will be legally liable if we haven't put adequate protection in place for you. Not only that, you're one of our colleagues, so we want to look after you. So that's first and foremost is about protecting our people. Secondly is about protecting our assets, protecting our factories, our physical footprints, and so on. So, if we're going to build a new factory somewhere, a company in the pharmaceutical sector will look at the geopolitical landscape and say, okay, well, if we're going to base our new factory in Mexico, that's where we've decided to place it for commercial reasons. Is this safe to do so? What sort of protective measures do we need to put in place? And what's the long-term geopolitical horizon and local political horizon look like for this area of Mexico? Is this a good investment? It's maybe going to take us 15 years to make money on that factory because it's such a huge investment. Let's make sure that in 15 years' time that the country hasn't fallen apart and we're not able to operate there anymore. So it can help with those long-term decisions as well. Then there's, I'd say, the more kind of tactical uses. So in the pharmaceutical industry, counterfeit products are a major problem. You would be shocked by the types of medicines that people are willing to counterfeit. Things, critical medicines for cancer patients, insulin, things like that are being counterfeited, often with no active ingredient. So people are taking medicine that they need to stay alive. And if there are counterfeits finding their way into the supply chain, they risk taking stuff that is potentially not only not helping them, it's actually putting them in danger. So using intelligence to try and crack down on that, to try and find who are the gangs behind this kind of stuff, where are they operating, where are they manufacturing from. I think people often have this image of the pharma world as, that it's all about the money, it's kind of big pharma and so on. And in reality, what I found since working in the pharma industry is it's a lot of people who genuinely care about this stuff. It's people who are genuinely very passionate about developing new medicines, about fighting diseases. And when you see some of the stories about counterfeit medicines that come out there, it's genuinely terrifying. And yeah, that's something that the industry really wants to clamp down on. And it's really not about the money, because at the end of the day, most of the countries where this is happening in are places where the medical system is collapsing, where there are huge geopolitical instabilities that make it not profitable for pharma companies to operate, but it's still putting people in danger. And that's something that people in this industry just cannot tolerate. So that's one of the biggest uses in this field, is using intelligence tools, techniques to try and find these gangs. How are they operating, and how can we stop them? So that's one of the areas that I think a lot of people in the industry draw a lot of pride from. And that looks a lot like other industries, that have similar threats, similar problems that they have to operate with. But yeah, so it's a very broad landscape that it can be useful, but you can see quite a lot of ways to use intelligence there.
Yeah, no, I think we've done work around this actually early on, also around, I think the collective name that they use often is brand protection. It's very interesting, and I think people will be surprised how widespread the problem is, and how integrated in certain countries, like, for example, in African countries, counterfeit medications outnumber actual medications, which is pretty crazy. Another industry that I find very interesting, and when I started my company, I would have loved to work in that industry, and I was very passionate about it. It just didn't happen, because of the way we developed. But in your book, you talk about professional sports, and I would love to hear also more about that, and like how intelligence plays a role in professional sports.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting field. So it's one of the first places that I came across in my history to use, in a kind of modern context, intelligence, was the National Football League in the US. And at the time, in the sort of late 60s, they were quite worried about mafia infiltration of the league to organize match fixing. And what they were concerned about was, even if there was a perception that matches were being fixed, it would kill interest in the sport. So they knew they had to jump on this very quickly. So they hired a former US intelligence community guy whose name is escaping me right now, but he founded a company called Intertel, which was basically a intelligence contractor that came in to kind of screen employees, use kind of counterintelligence tools to root out any risk of infiltration of the industry. And that's more on the defensive side. There's a phenomenal book called Spies on the Sidelines, which goes really deeply into how American football teams and other sports teams are actually using intelligence methodology to spy on each other to try and get a competitive edge. Can they figure out the opposing team's strategy? Can they figure out what their weaknesses are, and so on, by everything from bugging changing rooms to putting surveillance drones over training fields and all sorts of things. So it's a field that has been widely using intelligence for a very, very long time. They've even got their own name for it. I believe they call it skunking, spying on rival teams' practice sessions.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. What about doping? I think that's another interesting one.
Yeah, it's an area I've not really spent much time on, but when you look at some of the accusations in recent years of nation-state level involvement in some of the big doping scandals, you could imagine some of the very sophisticated techniques being used to pressure testing agencies to get around those sorts of controls, to find out how much certain sports leagues know about certain new technologies. So it would not surprise me at all if that part of the world is really using intelligence methodology in quite an aggressive way, because they are vulnerable to some pretty big nation state level threats.
Yeah. No, it's the big one is obviously Russia and that big scandal. A phenomenal documentary, Icarus. If you've seen it, that's really good. But I have a friend who set up for a large organization a team that would look into doping and basically build an intelligence function. And this was during COVID, so I don't know where it is right now, but it's something maybe I thought you came across. We started out with the differences between government and private sector. Today and in recent times, how do you see governments and the private sector interacting, and on the side of collaboration, giving them a competitive edge? I mean, in the book you talk about state-sponsored industrial espionage, and could you talk a little bit more about that, because that for me was the most fascinating part?
It's a really fascinating part of the industry, and it's one that I think is evolving a lot. I think traditionally there's been not that much interaction between public and private. I think the public sector, government intelligence, has largely, kind of like everyone else, been unaware that private sector intelligence exists. Occasionally, a few people know that there are these jobs you can do when you leave your agency in the private sector, but they don't really know much about what goes on there all day, except for some very niche cases where there was a bit of cooperation. And I think there's a few ways that can manifest, and that's changing now. So traditionally, it would be big national champions would come to the government to say, we need a bit of help here. So there are suggestions that the British intelligence services in the 50s and 60s were helping oil and gas companies vet employees in the Gulf states to make sure they didn't have links to the Communist Party, or that they could be infiltrating the industry, that they could be saboteurs and so on. Those very niche cases. But what's happened over time is I think governments have started building links with the private sector because they're starting to realize that economic security is a big part of national security. Some governments have been very advanced on this. I think the US in particular, the US State Department since the 1980s, I believe, has run the Overseas Security Advisory Council, OSAC, which is a phenomenal organization that essentially provides American and allied countries' companies with unclassified intelligence directly from the State Department, but also provides a platform for them to share intelligence with each other. And OSAC, I think, is the biggest and most advanced of these organizations. But there are other governments that have taken slightly different approaches. The French, for example, have long been accused of using national intelligence agencies to provide competitive edge to some of their national champions. There are a few examples. Supposedly in the late 80s, Air France had supposedly been allowing, or had been bugged by DGSE, the French intelligence service, every transatlantic business class seat in order to spy on US executives to try and get an edge for French businesses. There are examples of exempting French men from national service if they went to work for foreign technology firms. And when the Americans called out the French on this practice, the French spy chief, Pierre Maron, he responded saying, it's an elementary blunder to think we're allies. When it comes to business, it's war. And there's a much more aggressive mindset of this. There's a school here in Paris called the École Guerre Économique, which is like the School of Economic Warfare. And the mindset of this school, I think, really does capture some of the broader French mindset on this, that economics is a form of war. That dirigist economy takes this view of, we need to be actively engaging in this as if it's a battlefield. So much more direct involvement in this. And then at the far end of that spectrum, you've got other much more command economy states. The big one people often talk about is China, but there's a number of governments, Russia, Iran, Israel has been accused of this, among many others, of essentially using national intelligence capabilities in order to try and exfiltrate tech that they can then use to bolster national defense. I always think it's a bit naive to just point to China when we see this threat, because the reality is pretty much every country on the planet has been caught in some capacity doing something along these lines. Everyone's playing the economic espionage game, so it would be naive to only blame one country for it. But it is a real problem, and it's something that, when a company is trying to defend itself against this, if they're up against a nation-state level threat, it's a very, very big challenge. Now, it's not to say they're defenseless. There are some pretty impressive tools that are available to private sector companies looking to protect against these threats, but often they do require a lot of cooperation with the state on this. And I think the recent sabotage trend in Europe is really bringing that to people's attention. I think governments are realizing they need to get more close in cooperation with companies. I think what governments often really struggle with is how do they interface with the company. A few various government organizations I've spoken to, when they have something that they want to tell the company based on a threat, their view is often, we'll just tell the CEO. That's fine, but the CEO is not really going to know what to do with that. Their head is up in the clouds. They're dealing with big strategic issues. You need to be talking to maybe the CSO or someone, functional that can actually fix this stuff. So I think a lot of it comes down to figuring out how to interface with each other. But governments are starting to pay attention to this, and they're starting to put a lot more effort into getting those interfaces right. So it's something I think we are going to see evolve over time.
Yeah. I've seen something also that, for example, in my country, the Netherlands, especially with ASML, a chip manufacturer, there's a lot of cooperation there. But from the companies, I think also, I spoke with somebody there that they feel that they need more tools to see like, hey, how do we look at our people inside a threat, these type of things. So I think there's a way to go there. And I think for a lot of governments, it's very hard to share information but not say how they got it. In protection of sources and methods, how do we know this is true, right? This is the question that they can get. But I see this development of private sector because, as I mentioned earlier, that there are private sector companies that have capabilities that are shocking, like how good they are, for a private sector. Do you see the capabilities between nation states, especially the smaller ones, and private sector blurring? And do you think that this might cause regulation? Or
I think that's a tremendously important question. I think in some areas, in some very niche capability areas, they're already at parity. And in some places, the private sector has surpassed governments. And I think this is something that really catches people off guard. I've come across certain tools that I don't believe governments can do. And we've seen cases such as the Pegasus spyware scandal, where governments are buying these capabilities from the private sector, which reinforces that view that they can't do this indigenously. They're having to outsource it. So I think that is something that people are largely unaware of. In terms of regulation, I think so. I think people are really uncomfortable with the idea of advanced intelligence capabilities outside of the state because it's so misunderstood. And because, most of the time when we're aware of it, it's because there's been some sort of scandal. So I think there will be growing attention on how these tools are out there. Now, I think, Pegasus is a really interesting case. This was developed in Israel. Israel has some pretty strict export controls on anything dual use and who it can be sold to. So as a result, it was only sold to governments. We did see reports of some governments abusing it, which does show you that those controls are clearly not enough. But I think there's very little standing in the way of a private sector actor developing those kind of capabilities in a state that doesn't have export controls, or in potentially a failed state somewhere where there is very little governance in place to regulate it. And what happens when those kind of tools are available to terrorist groups, to very serious threat organizations, criminal gangs, and so on. So, it's something that I think we do need to be really closely aware of, because these things don't stay in the private sector. The talent bleeds out, and the capabilities bleed up with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think another example is Starlink. That, because of the war in Ukraine, it kind of has shown its effective use on battlefields, and it has shown up everywhere. I mean, I've seen it all over Africa where they're not supposed to be available, but they are available. There's a whole cottage industry, I think, of reselling. I think there was a company either in Spain or Italy that was accused of selling like 50,000 or 100,000 Starlinks to Russia. And often these individuals or these companies don't even know where it's going. So the supply chain risk for these dual-use technologies is a big problem, I think.
I mean, this is something I say in the second page of the book. When I'm making this argument, we have to pay attention to private sector intelligence. I make the point that in a world where actions taken by these quasi-sovereign companies, which is how they've been described by some other scholars, where these companies can alter the course of a war, a national election, intelligence, international relations, and security scholars shouldn't overlook the capabilities they have. And when I talk about alter the course of the war, I use two examples that are cited in the footnote there. One is Microsoft, who entered the war very early on Ukraine's side and were able to, by all accounts, stop a number of quite sophisticated cyber attacks. But the other example is Starlink, that Starlink was disabled during an attack supposedly on the Black Sea Fleet, and as a result, the attack wasn't able to go ahead. Two examples where companies or individual actors in some cases have stepped in and quite literally changed the course of history. It really shows how important it is to understand this stuff.
Can private companies like Starlink, it happens to be another Elon Musk company, Twitter or X, can they be told by a government in a democratic society to not do business or to do business? Maybe that's a better question. To do business with a certain actor, country, group that they don't want to do business with.
Oh, we've seen that through the sanctions regime, for example. So there's the hard and soft power of governments. The soft power is trying to convince these companies to say, look, we'd prefer you didn't do this. There's the kind of middle ground, which is we'll give you contracts or we'll take away contracts, in this defense space if you continue to do this. And then there's the hard end of that, which is we're just going to put legal sanctions in place and you will face criminal penalties if you do this. The problem is, as you say, global supply chains are so complex. It's often very hard to know where certain capabilities are ending up. So it's why, another area that intelligence is quite useful is being able to know where your own products are going and what you can do to ensure that you're compliant with sanctions. But there's quite a lot of tools in government's toolkits. But what we're seeing with some of the sanctions evasion related to this war is that there's a lot of holes in those strategies, that they are far from perfect and they require active cooperation from the private sector.
Yeah. I think what I find interesting also, and it makes it very hard, I think, for private sector intelligence organizations as well as governments to work together, is the example of dual use technologies appearing in drones, ballistic missiles, right? And then from what I've seen, there's two schools of thought. Some researchers, they publish, name and shame the companies, and some don't, but reach out to the companies and say, hey, how do we help you solve this? In the case of the high profile naming and shaming, it doesn't work because they don't want to work with you anymore, because you've put it out that they are responsible, even though chips that were used in a smart dishwasher ended up in a drone. Like, that's not something that they could have known, I think. But do you see a greater cooperation in that, or does this need for, especially from like researchers of publishing this information, hamper cooperation?
I don't think it's hampering it. I think it is advancing things. I see this a lot. A lot of the companies I talk to, they say, we are worried about being named and shamed in one of these instances. That's why we have to do this kind of stuff. The problem is, if you work for a dishwasher manufacturer and you say, hey, we need resources and tools, and we need to spend money and time on building an intelligence team to stop our products being used in battlefield applications, they'll look at you and go, what do you mean? We make dishwashers. How could they possibly be used? It's a hard sell. Whereas if you go to them and say, look at this case, one of our competitors, one of our peers has just been, they've just had a huge reputation scandal because their products are being used for military applications. We need to avoid the same thing happening to us. Therefore, I need resources, I need analysts, I need tools. The company will have a much easier time understanding that, and they will want to avoid that outcome. And, it's one of those things that people, I think, broadly, most people I come across day to day in the corporate world want to do the right thing, but sometimes systems make that a little bit challenging, that there aren't just resources there to do the right thing without having to convince people. And I think a lot of the work in that space by activists, by scholars, is really helping, because it's giving people in-house the tools to surround and say, we need to solve this problem, and here is why. So I think they are helping in a really big way. And I think people see it as a very adversarial relationship. But in reality, I think actually it's something that does move that argument forward. And that's a good thing.
Very interesting. And you mentioned also, speaking of controversy, some of the private companies like NSO, which built Pegasus. And then there's another one, Black Cube, which I think for the longest time I've never really understood what Black Cube was until they were named in the whole scandal with Weinstein, and that it became a little bit more public. Could you tell a little bit more about them?
Yeah, I think they're a really interesting company that sits within a very strange niche of these companies that seem to want to fully emulate the popular image of a government intelligence agency. There's others. I came across one British company that seems to really want to emulate the British intelligence services, but for CEOs. And I think these companies, I think they play a little bit up the James Bond image. They play up this secret agent aura. They imply a lot of connections with their old government agencies, which I think carries a lot of cachet, implies they can get access to something that others couldn't. And I'm always a little bit skeptical of that, because most government intelligence services, once you're out, you're out. You don't get to just pop in for a coffee and take a look at the secret files. Yes, you may know people in that world still, but very often they will go to prison if they talk to you about active cases and so on. So I'm always very skeptical of that. There's a great paper by a scholar called Kirill Avramov called Victory at Any Price, and he's looking at the Israeli intelligence vendors, and in particular he looks very closely at Black Cube. And the argument he makes quite compellingly is that most companies, when they suffer some sort of scandal, when they've been caught involved in something that is perceived as completely inappropriate, such as spying on activists, spying on accusers of sexual harassment, which was the case, that's what Black Cube were accused of doing. It normally kills the company, but he argues that Black Cube have actually continued to operate, and he makes the argument that it's because they've got this reputation as a company that will do whatever needs to be done, even the shady stuff. So I think they've carved out this very strange niche for themselves. I think they tend to be, and I think one of the reasons folks like you and I find them a little bit unusual is because they're at such an arm's distance from the wider industry, because I think there's that reputational baggage that comes with firms like that I think the wider industry does not want anything to do with them. I know for a fact my company would not engage with a company like that because we simply don't want to be seen as doing business with a company that has been accused of the things they've been accused of, regardless of whether those accusations are correct or not. It's a lot of baggage. And I think a lot of companies think the same way about that. So, they are a real oddity in the industry. I think they're also treated, a lot of these companies, like I said, with suspicion by practitioners in the more mainstream field, because a lot of people in this industry come from some sort of government intelligence background. There's about 57% of practitioners have a government background. So when people play on that too much, it's often a little bit suspicious because you don't need that background to do this job, and those connections generally aren't as helpful as people might think.
Absolutely. I'm incredibly fascinated by this. It's, even me in it, I've learned so much from your book, and I really appreciate you going into it. Maybe on another note, something I wanted to ask you is, because you are an intelligence scholar, practitioner, private as well as public, what advice would you give somebody that is listening to this, either a young person or somebody even wants to change careers? What would you say to them, and what steps would you recommend taking?
It's one of my favorite questions. I think it's an important growing field, and we need talent. So I would say, firstly, don't be afraid to give it a try. There's no one route into this industry. I've met people with so many different incredible backgrounds, people who've come from all sorts of odd places. People have this idea if you have to have worked in the CIA or MI6 or wherever. No, that's not true. You can come from anywhere. So whatever background you've got, find the skills in your current job that you think would make you good at this. The key thing I would say you need to be is curious and creative. If you can be those two things, you'll be good in this field, because if you're curious to the point where you can't just see something and go, oh, that looks odd, I'm not going to investigate that further, you'll struggle. But if you're the sort of person who has to know, it's going to bug you if you don't know the answer to that, you're going to do well. And then if you've got the creativity to find the ways legally and ethically to get that information, you'll also do really well. So say if you've got those character traits, don't be afraid. This is certainly a good industry to be in. In terms of practically getting in, it's a really challenging industry in that sense. I often say to people that getting your first job in private sector intelligence is one of the hardest fields to break into. Once you've got your first job, getting your second, third, fourth jobs are so easy because it's so networked. Everyone knows everyone. Once you're into that network, it's really easy to move around. But getting that first job is very hard. Some advice I would give people is start networking as soon as possible. Get involved with industry associations like the Association of International Risk Intelligence Professionals. There's various OSINT collectives. Get known by people. I would say if you're not looking at government intelligence, if there's no reason to not have a public profile in this kind of stuff, start building up a portfolio of intelligence work. Write about geopolitics, write about security topics, do investigations and publish those investigations, write articles about how you found what you found. And it can be anything. I've seen people who have done things like, I'm going to start counting tanks on battlefields in Ukraine, and I'm going to publish daily trackers on that. And people who do that kind of thing often end up getting hired by industry because people say, well, wow, that's someone who's really good at this stuff. So I'd say build that portfolio as much as possible and build that network. And those two things give you the start of a track record and a good reputation that can help get you in. Don't be afraid to ask people for advice. It's a really friendly industry. People are really keen to help new joiners get in because it's such a friendly, collaborative place. People want to meet future colleagues. They want to help them get started. So don't be afraid to reach out to folks. The one thing I would say not to do is don't apply blind to jobs in this field. If you see a job on LinkedIn or on a job site, don't just fire off an application. Use your intelligence skills to try and find out who are the hiring managers, who are the sort of colleagues in this team. Try and identify them using things you can find on the open source and approach them in a non-creepy way. Don't do anything illegal or dodgy, but approach people on LinkedIn and say, hey, I've seen this job posted. Is that with your team? I'd love to pick your brain about it, learn a little bit more, get to know these people in the same way you would develop a human source, build rapport with these people, and that will massively increase your chance of getting in. Jobs that you can be the most qualified person on the planet in this industry, and if you fire off a blind application online, there's a good chance it's just going to go in the bin because often it doesn't get through the automatic filter. Maybe the HR department don't really understand the role, which is a real common problem. So you really need that human to vouch for you and say, yeah, this person seems like the right person for this role. So I'd say be bold, get out there, network as much as possible, and try and be known to the industry.
I would say single best advice I've heard on this podcast. Fantastic. Thank you so much. You basically said everything that I tell young people to do. And and keep reaching out because they reach out a lot. But I always find it fascinating to speak with people or do internships. We have a long running internship. Your advice, not advice, but your recommendations, cultural recommendations. I would like to. What are you listening to? What are you reading? What are you watching?
So I suppose if you'll allow me to be a bit shameless here, I'm
Go ahead.
hosting my own podcast called How to Get on a Watch List, where we interview folks from across the industry on security, intelligence
Amazing
matters.
podcast, by the way.
Thank you very much. But I would say not just for self-promotion reasons. What I really encourage people to listen to that for is it will give you an idea of the variety of careers out there. Much like you do, we ask the question, how did you get into this line of work? And you can see the routes people take. And, I think it's a really great way to, if you're not sure what you want to do with your life, take a listen. I'm sure you'll find some stuff that interests you in there. So that's one I've been listening to a lot. I think in the intelligence space, we're living in a golden age of podcasts right now. There's yours, there's Spycast, there's Spycraft 101. There's so many of these out there. So I'd say, honestly, you're spoiled for choice when it comes to learning about the industry and just learning about intelligence in general. So I've been really happy with that. In terms of reading right now,
obviously your book.
Quite a tough choice. I mean, I could probably only shamelessly plug myself once, right?
Yeah.
But I've been reading a few different ones at the moment. Deep Dive by Ray Baker on open source intelligence is absolutely fantastic. I've just put it on my reading list for my students. There's so many guides out there to OSINT, and it's so hard to keep up to date with it. What I really like about this book is it gives a really structured way of looking at what is OSINT and just what are the basic nuts and bolts of this kind of stuff. And it's written in a really accessible, nice way. I've been really enjoying that book. So, huge applause to Ray Baker for that. And then I've also been doing some very kind of niche topical reading. A lot of my job is learning about a certain part of the world very quickly. So I'm often having to really deep dive into a particular niche topic. But I think those kind of structural books, let's call them, on things like OSINT are always really important. So that's probably my number one recommendation right now.
Maybe non-intelligence or shows or films or whatever.
I would say shows on the Intel side. There's a French show called The Bureau de Legends. It's available subtitled in English as The Bureau. It's fantastic. Yeah, such a great series. I really enjoyed that. And I think it's one of the more realistic shows out there. The French intelligence service, DGSE, were involved in the production of that show. And I'd heard from folks in that world that they really like it because it really helped them change their image. Traditionally, the French intelligence services were seen as quite crude and brutish. They didn't have the sort of James Bond image that folks in the UK might have. And this show, I think, really helped professionalize them as an organization, professionalize their image. So I think that's a really great one. Non-Intel stuff at the moment, I've been reading a book on the Dreyfus Affair, which is a really fascinating history. For those not familiar with French history, This was a artillery officer, a Jewish artillery officer who was accused of spying for Germany in the late 1800s in Paris, and it was seen as a huge miscarriage of justice. By all accounts, he was innocent, and essentially was sent to a very harsh penal colony for several years, where and really kind of gave up hope. But his family persisted and were able to basically get him released and get him exonerated. It's a shocking, tragic, but fascinating story with a little bit of intelligence in there. But the real story there is, it's about corruption. It's about the kind of miscarriage of justice, and one that I really enjoyed reading.
Fantastic. I know the book. Highly recommend it. My last question, I ask this sometimes, but do you have a question for me?
I don't, off the top of my head. That's a good question, though.
I mean, that's good.
It's a really good question.
That you don't have to. That's fine. I like to surprise people sometimes with that one, but I want to really thank you so much.
I have one. Sorry, I have a question. If I can.
Go ahead.
Having read the book, what should I have covered? Because I feel like I left so much out the field. What's the thing that you regret me not putting in there?
That's a great question. Because there's not really, because I would be saying things that I've encountered, but there's no real way of researching it, right? So there's an intersection where, especially the more special mission units kind of organizations and militaries work with private sector, where they might not have the intel they need to do their job. And so that's one. And I would say procurement.
Oh, two great areas.
Yeah. Procurement, like getting access to certain technologies or hardware, that helicopters, missiles, whatever, in countries that are considered denied. There's often in those kind of countries a whole like smuggling network, where a government might ask a private organization to get access to those.
Yeah.
That would have been a good one, I think.
I'm gonna sit up all night. That's gonna really bug me now that I didn't look at those areas.
No, that's okay.
That's a great answer
for the next one.
Yeah. Wow. What yeah. No, I love that. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. I've mentioned to you this offline that or outside of the podcast that we at Great Dynamics and the team, and especially the producer who's listening to this, is a big fan of your work, and so am I. And we really wanted to talk to you because I think your book gives a very fair and detailed breakdown of the industry, and I think you've done that with a lot of grace and lack of bias. So I really applaud you to that, because it's a fantastic book. I think a book that was needed. As I said, I am jealous that I didn't write it. But again, thank you so much for taking the time. And for everybody else that's listening, please go out, get the book. We'll put Lewis's information, the ones that he wants out, in the show notes, and a link to his book. And there might be some like interesting surprise on that too. So keep an eye out, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Thank you, Lewis.
Ahmed, thank you very much for having me.